In this video, we're going to be talking about the rise of the labor movement. It develops as a result of the big business practices we looked at last time, right? So the Gilded Age is about this extravagant wealth um, and these wealthy robber barons, as they're called, right? These wealthy captains of industry, people who come to dominate specific industries, people like John D. Rockefeller, who comes to dominate the oil industry, Andrew Carnegie, who comes to dominate the steel industry, J.P. Morgan Chase, right? The Vanderbilts, and its other families as well. And so all these industries have these major monopolies or large businesses and corporations. And when they have all this power, the people who don't have the power are those who work for these individuals and these companies. And so the rise of the labor movement develops because of the unfair practices and the mistreatment of workers that worked in these factories all throughout the United States. And so, just to clarify, a union is an organization of workers that work together to improve conditions in the workplace, right? And so, unions, many people are part of unions today, and what they use different tactics like collective bargaining. People in unions pay dues or fees, right, to help support the efforts of the union. Um, they also strike, right, and all these things help to achieve their goals of safer working conditions, better pay, less hours, right, retirement pensions, all these things that many workers today enjoy are the result of the efforts of the labor movement, which begins really in the Gilded Age in the 1880s or so. It really starts to increase at that point. Right? And so the driving factor behind the rise in unions are really a couple things, right? Uh, Two major ones I would say are poor wages, low wages, and poor working conditions. Those are really the two major ones. And as more immigrants arrive in the United States, right, the cities, especially New York City, right, become overcrowded. Lower Manhattan becomes filled with what we call tenements, which are poorly constructed, poorly ventilated, unsafe housing, right? That people would live, 10, 15 people in a two-room apartment. Um, Apartments didn't have bathrooms, right? They had to go down to the outhouses in the backyards, right, to go to the bathroom, right? So there was a lot of unsanitary conditions as well. Um, Over time, people begin to try to save some money, right, from rent and things like that. They begin opening sweatshops. They begin opening factories in these tenement buildings, right? In the back room of their apartments, they would have people working to make clothing, for example, stitching buttons onto fabric, things like that. Basic menial tasks, right? These tenements, people who worked in these tenements, these sweatshops, I should say, were poor. They got paid very little, and they lived in cramped, crowded conditions. They worked for hours on end, could be 12, 14 hours a day, with no break. It was a very harsh existence and a very dangerous existence for the people. There was constantly fires or other mishaps, accidents, right? And there was no protections. There was no health insurance. There was no, uh, disability leave. None of those things that people today can fall back on. They did not exist during this time period, right? And so keep that in mind, right? These people really, if something happened to them, they were in deep trouble. And so these unions begin forming because workers get fed up with how they're being treated. And they begin kind of pushing and organizing and having things move towards a better and safer work condition. One of the major, I should say, not one of the earlier, but one of the major unions is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And they kind of organized beginning in 1886, but they were organized for craft unions, right? So these are skilled workers. So if you were a carpenter, if you were a mechanic, if you were other things that involved skill, right? That's who they kind of organized, right? Because they had more leverage than the unskilled workers, right? They could demand, well, if you don't have us, you can't build things, right? You can't have machines operating, right? And so they had some more leverage than the other workers we're going to look at in just a minute. They were led by a man named Samuel Gompers, who was the leader of the AFL. They were very successful in gaining, or relatively successful, I should say, in gaining better wages and working conditions for these craft workers, these skilled workers. They brought together multiple unions. So historically, what happened was if you were a carpenter, there would be the carpenters union. If you were a mechanic, you were in the mechanics union. If you were a shoemaker, you were in the shoemakers union, right? And so each industry, each job kind of had its own union. The American Federation of Labor is really important because it moves past that. It actually gathers several unions. So now you could say, for example, you'd have the mechanics, carpenters, and plumbers, let's say, right, all working all under one umbrella union, right? And so that's more powerful because the more people you have on your side, the better chance you have of getting things done. So if the plumbers go on strike, the carpenters and the mechanics might follow, right? And so now you have not just one industry suffering, but widespread suffering throughout the economy, right? And this would kind of encourage employers to kind of give into the demands more quickly, so we can kind of get the economy back running, right? So these umbrella organizations, these umbrella unions, are really important. These are two other important labor leaders. One in particular is Eugene Debs, who we're going to focus on. Right, he's really important because he is a socialist, and so during this time you have the socialist movement, the communist movement is growing. Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto in Germany, did that in the 1880s. Right, so this is the same time that socialism and communism are developing. Right, and communism is having the people, the workers, control everything, and they get that accomplished through a violent revolution, a class struggle, right? Socialism is different. Socialism is working through the existing system to pass and to have the government provide more welfare services for the poor and working class people, right? And so he was a socialist, but many people view that as communism, right? It's antithetical. It's against capitalism. Socialism and capitalism are conflicting systems, and so many of the business owners, many of the people in America, right, were opposed and are opposed to socialism even to this day, right? But Eugene Debs leads a different organization. He leads a union of unskilled workers, right? So the people who work in these tenements and the factories and the sweatshops, he leads those people, right? Which is a lot larger group of people, and the people who are suffering the most, right? He's actually in prison for for his views, right, in America, which is something that might sound surprising, and his involvement in some of the strikes. But he runs as a socialist candidate for president of the United States 5 times. One of those times in 1912, he actually wins 6% of the total vote, which is one of the higher end for third-party candidates in our country. Right? Typically, third-party candidates don't do very well. But that's it's saying that his message of socialism was kind of appealing to a lot of people during this time. Right, so as I said, Eugene Debs helped organize industrial workers, these unskilled people, the person who sat in a sweatshop and stitched a button onto a shirt, right, and did that all day long, right? Not a skilled job. They paid even worse than those skilled jobs did, right? They really suffered, and so they were fighting for the rights of these factory workers, for better pay, shorter hours, days off, and better working conditions. And so one of the organizations that's formed is the Industrial Workers of the World. Right? It's a socialist organization, right? Again, it's an organization that promotes socialism, is against capitalism, right? Saying that there should be government regulation, there should be better welfare protections for working class people. Right? And throughout American history, right, strikes have turned violent pretty often, particularly during this time period. Uh, And the reason for that is because the government at this time was largely supportive of the capitalist system, largely supportive of the big business owners, right? And so when there was protests and that threatened the profits of these big businesses and the big business owners, they actually were able to get the military to come in, right, or police forces to come in and stop these protests, right, stop these strikes. In fact, going on strike was actually illegal for a while as well. Right, and so one example is the Great Strike of 1877. It was the railroad workers under George Pullman. He was the owner of the Pullman Car Company. They cut wages, right? So not only did they not increase the wages, they actually decreased the wage. And this led to protests in the streets, and the federal troops had to go in to stop the protests and stop the violence. A really notorious affair in American history and an unfortunate event in American history is the Haymarket Affair, or the Haymarket Riot. This was in 1886. There was protests going on in Chicago, and anarchists, people who believe in no government, right, wanted to get rid of the government, so not really part of the labor movement, detonated bombs in Haymarket Square in Chicago, killing people, and this gave unions a really bad press. And in fact, an organization known as the Knights of Labor, who came before the American Federation of Labor, their union pretty much fell apart as a result of this event, right? And so for a moment, you're going to see, right, that union membership actually decreases for a little bit before then it skyrockets once again. The Pullman Company strike is a result of the Panic of 1873. That should sound familiar from our Reconstruction unit. Due to this panic, right, which started with the railroad companies actually to begin with. That's just a wage, right? The Pullman company cut wages and laid off people, fired people. They sent in people, so then the workers went on strike. The company brought in strike breakers, those who crossed the picket line to work while the regular workers were on strike, which led to fights because the people on the picket line believed they were traitors, and they started fighting. There was tension. So President Cleveland had to send in troops, right? And because of all the violence, Eugene Debs, leader of the railway union, was actually imprisoned, kind of blamed for it and imprisoned, right? So violent strikes were very common during this time period. It was a tense period between the working class and the business elite. Right, so this image here just shows us the Haymarket Square, right, and what was happening when the bombs go off. Police officers then start firing at people. There's this conflict and tension, and people die as a result. Right, you can kind of, this picture really shows you the chaos of the moment, right? The fear in some people's eyes, people laying on the ground, right? Really a hectic experience. One of the hallmark moments in this labor movement practice that actually leads to some meaningful reforms, originally in New York and then they spread elsewhere, is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which you guys probably have heard of before. It's an infamous event, an infamous factory that was known for its unsafe conditions. They would actually lock the doors so that people wouldn't leave during their work hours and steal the fabric out of the factory. And in 1911, with numerous violations, code violations, fire safety violations, there was a fire that started as a small fire, but the doors were locked and it spread like wildfire in the factory, killing 150 people. Many women, and it was almost entirely women, young women who were immigrants, particularly Jewish and Italian immigrant women. Many jumped to their deaths because they, instead of being burned to death, and it was a devastating thing. Really propelled the labor movement in New York. New York City established a New York State, established a commission to look into this and propose new reforms that became law. Right, fire escapes were necessary, sprinklers, all these things, not locking the doors. All these things become law as a result of this factory fire. Right, and that's thanks to the labor response, largely of women at the time. Many female protesters actually helped push this and convince the state to make changes. Okay, so these next are some images of the event, right? This is from the Museum of the City of New York, this image, which is up in Manhattan. You can see this on the right here. This is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This was the factory, right, and it looks completely destroyed. You can see it was so hot it melted the fire escapes, right? It did some serious damage. So this image is a little more graphic, right? It shows the bodies of victims laid out, and what they did was they had to lay them out, and they were unidentifiable, right? So people had to come and try to identify their relatives to see if they were in the fire and had died, right? Many were unidentifiable because of how severely they were burnt. Right, and just to end now with this chart, to show you how union membership fluctuated throughout time, right? One of the questions in your lecture activity actually to look at kind of a dip, right? When did this dip? So take a minute to kind of find that. And also, what year does it start really dramatically increasing, total union membership, and in particular the American Federation of Labor, right? And so you can see as we move into the 1900s, labor union membership dramatically increases, and that is no coincidence then that in the first decades of the 1900s is when a lot of important labor laws are actually passed. All right, so we'll talk more about this stuff in class together when I see you guys next.